A man nobody noticed walked into a room full of millionaires and walked out with the most valuable car in the world for $100. The people laughing at him had no idea they'd just handed him everything. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off by someone who thought they knew better, stay with me, because this story is for you. Drop a like and comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The auction house smelled like old money and fresh ambition. That particular combination of leather polish, expensive cologne, and the kind of quiet desperation that rich people try very hard to disguise as confidence. Chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling of the Hargrove Grand Ballroom like frozen explosions of light, casting everything below in a warm gold that made even the most ordinary things look important. Rows of padded chairs held men and women in tailored suits and understated jewelry, people who owned things most people only ever read about: islands, racehorses, art collections, buildings with their names carved into the stone above the entrance. The Ashcroft Autumn Collectors Invitational happened once a year, and getting an invitation meant something. It meant you had either inherited enough money that people stopped asking questions, or you'd made enough of your own that they started asking different ones. Either way, you belonged to a particular world, one where a car wasn't just transportation, it was a statement about who you were and what you could afford to not care about. Owen Granger did not belong to that world. He'd gotten in through a side entrance, wearing a jacket he'd bought 3 years ago for his sister's wedding and hadn't worn since. The jacket still fit, mostly, though the shoulders were a little stiff. He had a guest badge clipped to the lapel, a favor from Marcus Webb, a parts dealer he'd known for 15 years who occasionally acquired vehicles through estate sales and needed someone to verify engine conditions before committing to a purchase. Marcus hadn't been able to make it that evening. Family thing, he'd said on the phone, but he'd called ahead and gotten Owen added to the list. Owen had almost turned it down. His son, Danny, was 8 years old and had a school project due the following Monday. They'd been planning to spend the weekend at the kitchen table with a poster board and a set of markers, building a model of the solar system out of foam balls and wire. It wasn't a complicated project, but Danny took every project seriously, the way only an 8-year-old who deeply wanted his teacher to think he was smart could take something seriously. "I can do it myself," Danny had told him that morning, with the particular dignity of a second grader who had clearly been waiting to use that phrase. "I'm not a baby." "I know you're not." "Then go. It's just a car auction." Owen had looked at his son for a long moment, at the cowlick at the back of his head that no amount of water or combing had ever fully defeated, at the slightly too large ears that Owen privately thought he'd grow into by the time he was 12. He'd said he'd be home by 9. It was now 7:40, and he was standing at the back of the Hargrove Grand Ballroom, holding a catalog he'd barely glanced at, watching a man in a white dinner jacket sell a 1963 Aston Martin DB5 to a hedge fund manager from Connecticut for $2.3 million. Owen watched the car get wheeled away on its display dolly and thought it was pretty, in the way that things you can never have are pretty. A distant, uncomplicated kind of appreciation. 2.3 million. He tried to do the math on how many engine rebuilds that was, then stopped because the number made him feel slightly ill. The auctioneer, a smooth, practiced man named Gerald Forthright, who had been doing this for 30 years and had the vocal cadence of someone who genuinely believed that the sound of his own voice was one of the finer things in life, consulted his notes and allowed himself a small, knowing pause. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we come now to lot 47. There was a shift in the room. Not excitement exactly, more like the collective lowering of expectations that happens when everyone in a space simultaneously decides something isn't worth their full attention. The vehicle that was wheeled out from behind the side curtain on a heavy reinforced dolly looked like it had survived something that it shouldn't have survived. The body was a deep charcoal where the original paint had burned away, with sections of the hood twisted upward in irregular peaks like paper caught in a sudden heat. The windshield frame was intact but empty, the glass gone. One of the rear quarter panels had been caved inward and then apparently tried to cave itself back out, resulting in a shape that suggested violence and failure in roughly equal measure. The front grille had partially melted and resolidified into something that bore only an approximate relationship to its original form. What could still be identified as an Aston Martin chassis was identifiable primarily by its dimensions and by a small, partially scorched emblem on the rear that had somehow survived. The catalog listed it as a 1968 Aston Martin DBS, provenance incomplete, condition poor, sold as is with no warranty or authentication of mechanical viability. Opening bid, $100. A ripple of quiet, indulgent laughter moved through the room. Not mean-spirited, exactly. More like the kind of laughter that comes from shared recognition. Oh, right. This one. Owen heard the woman to his left murmur something to her companion about it being a tax write-off, dressed up as entertainment. Her companion said something back that Owen didn't fully catch, but the tone was clear. Amused, dismissive, already done with it. Vivian Ashcroft was seated in the second row, which was where she always sat, close enough to project authority, far enough from the front to suggest she wasn't trying too hard. She was 32 years old, and she ran Ashcroft Automotive Legacy, the auction house and collectors consulting firm that her grandfather had founded and her father had grown, and that she had taken over at 28 with the kind of polished, intimidating competence that made people simultaneously respect her and slightly afraid to make eye contact. She was looking at her phone. The DBS had come into their inventory through a fire-damaged estate sale 6 months earlier. The previous owner, a reclusive collector named Harlan Fitch, who had died without children or a coherent will, had kept the car in a storage facility outside of Roanoke, Virginia, along with 43 other vehicles in varying states of disrepair. The facility had caught fire 18 months before Fitch's death. Most of the collection had been insured. The DBS had not. Vivian's acquisitions team had looked at it, photographed it, run the partial VIN against every database they had access to, and come back with nothing useful. The VIN plate had been damaged in the fire, and what remained was consistent with a 1968 DBS body shell, but yielded no registered ownership history beyond a 1987 import entry with a dealership in Maryland that no longer existed. It wasn't a mystery so much as a dead end. The car wasn't worth pursuing. It was as Vivian had told her acquisitions director Marcus Hale when he'd asked whether to include it in the catalog. 2 tons of expensive garbage with good bone structure. She'd included it because a catalog needed variety, and because watching a room full of serious collectors pointedly ignore something expensive-looking was its own kind of entertainment value, and because $100 in revenue was still technically revenue. Gerald Forthright repeated the opening bid figure with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned long ago not to editorialize about the items he was selling. "We have $100 as the opening bid. Do I have 110? Silence. 110 anywhere in the room? More silence. Someone in the back coughed. Owen was looking at the car. He'd been looking at it since it came out from behind the curtain, and he hadn't stopped looking. There was something wrong with the way he was looking at it. Wrong in the sense that it was the opposite of the way everyone else in the room was looking at it. Everyone else was looking at it with the practiced disinterest of people who had decided in advance what it was. Owen was looking at it the way he looked at everything that came into his garage on a flatbed, with the particular focused attention of someone trying to understand what something actually was before deciding what to do with it. He'd noticed it when the dolly first came out from behind the curtain, a detail so small and so buried under the damage that you would have had to be specifically looking for it or specifically familiar with the particular mechanical grammar of British sports car manufacturing in the 1960s to notice it at all. The suspension geometry was wrong. Not wrong as in damaged. The fire had certainly damaged things. Wrong as in deliberately engineered differently wrong. The front suspension pickup points, visible through the burned-away lower body panels, were positioned at a spacing that didn't match the standard DBS chassis drawings that Owen had spent more time studying than he would ever admit to anyone, because studying the engineering of cars he could never own was one of the things that kept him sane after a long day. The spacing was narrower, and the angle of the lower control arm mount was steeper by what his eye told him was approximately 8 or 10 degrees. That was not a fire damage artifact. That was a design choice. Owen understood, in the way that a person understands something that they can feel but not yet fully explain, that he was looking at something that wasn't what everyone in this room thought it was. He raised his paddle. Gerald Forthright registered this with visible, if professionally contained, surprise. He looked at Owen, at the slightly too formal jacket, the badge, the fact that he was standing at the back of the room, and then looked back at the room in general. "We have $100, he said. "Do I have 110? "Nothing. "Going once at $100. Owen's heartbeat was doing something irregular. He ignored it. "Going twice." The woman to Owen's left glanced at him with an expression he recognized. The look that people give you when they've categorized you as someone who is about to make a mistake in public. "Sold," said Gerald Forthright, "for $100. The laughter in the room was quiet and brief, the kind that people let out when they think they're being generous by not laughing harder. Owen heard it. He'd been hearing sounds like that his whole life, in different rooms for different reasons, and he had developed a fairly robust internal system for not caring about it. He walked forward to begin the paperwork. The logistics of removing a 2,000-pound fire-damaged vehicle from a ballroom at 11 o'clock at night were not straightforward. Owen had come with his truck, a 2009 Ford F350, with 180,000 miles on it, and a flatbed attachment that he'd bought secondhand from a towing company going out of business. And he spent 40 minutes working with two of the auction house's loading staff to get the DBS secured to the flatbed with enough strapping that he felt confident it wouldn't shift on the drive home. One of the loading staff, a big patient man named Carl, who had clearly spent years moving things that rich people had bought and immediately needed someone else to deal with, watched Owen work with what seemed like genuine curiosity. "You know what you bought?" Carl asked, not unkindly. "I think so," Owen said. "Maybe." "Lady Boss came back here during the break," Carl said. He meant Vivian. Owen had seen her from across the room, dark-suited, composed, the kind of person who moved through a crowded space without appearing to navigate it. She stood there and looked at it for a while. Didn't say anything, just looked. Owen glanced at him. "When was that?" "About an hour before it went to auction, right after the preview closed." Carl pulled a strap taut and locked it. "She had this look on her face like she was doing math." Owen thought about that for a moment. He thought about the suspension geometry. He thought about the VIN plate. "She say anything?" "Nope." Carl stepped back and looked at the strapped vehicle. $100, man." "Yeah," Owen said. "That's a lot of hurt for $100. "Or not," Owen said. "We'll see." He drove home carefully, taking surface streets to avoid the highway, keeping his speed below 40. The DBS sat on the flatbed behind him, black and broken against the darkness, passing under orange streetlights in slow intervals. Owen kept glancing in the rearview mirror at it, which was not a practical driving habit, but which he couldn't seem to stop doing. He got home at 11:20. Danny was asleep on the couch with the television on, a half-finished diagram of the solar system in marker and pencil balanced on his chest, rising and falling with his breathing. Owen stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment, at the foam ball that was supposed to be Saturn sitting on the cushion next to him, at the marker cap that had rolled under the coffee table, at the look on his son's sleeping face that was somehow still slightly focused, like even in sleep he was working on something. Owen turned off the television. He carried Danny to his bed without waking him, which was getting harder to do as Danny got bigger, but Owen wasn't ready to admit that yet. He tucked him in and picked Saturn up off the couch and set it on the kitchen table where it wouldn't get stepped on. Then he went back outside and stood next to the flatbed and looked at the car in the pale yellow light of the garage floodlights he'd installed when Danny was a baby, because he'd wanted to be able to see clearly when he came home late. It sat there, damaged and patient, holding its secrets the way things do when they've been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right questions. Owen's garage was a separate structure behind the house, a two-bay space he'd built out over 4 years, adding insulation, a proper lift, a parts washing station, better lighting, and a pegboard system for tools that Danny had helped organize at age 6, and which Danny still considered partially his. The house itself was a 3-bedroom rental in a working-class neighborhood in Culpeper, Virginia, a place with a good school district, which was why Owen had picked it, and which cost more per month than he was strictly comfortable with, which was why he worked the hours he worked. He ran the garage as a one-man operation, mostly, with occasional part-time help from a 22-year-old named Terrell, who was sharp with electrical systems and needed the work. Owen specialized in restoration and mechanical repair. Not the kind of restoration where you sand something to museum condition and charge $40,000 for a car that will never turn a wheel again, but the functional kind. The kind where a vehicle comes in broken and goes out running and is expected to keep running. He had a reputation for careful, thorough work, and for not charging people for things they didn't need, which was a business model that kept him solvent without ever quite making him comfortable. The DBS came off the flatbed the next morning on a Saturday, with Danny sitting on an upturned bucket near the garage door eating cereal out of a plastic bowl and watching with the alert, neutral interest of someone attending an event they weren't sure about yet. "Is it going to be a car again?" Danny asked. "That's the plan," Owen said, guiding the front of the chassis onto the lift plate. "What happened to it?" "Fire." Danny considered this. "Was anybody in it?" "No," Owen said. "Nobody was in it." "Good," Danny said, and went back to his cereal. Owen spent the first morning just looking. He walked around the vehicle slowly, taking photographs on his phone at close range, crouching down to look under the chassis, lying flat on the concrete to examine the floor pan. He took notes in a small wire-bound notebook that he kept in his shirt pocket, not because he couldn't trust his memory, but because writing things down made him see them more precisely. He made rough sketches with dimensions and arrows. What he found in those first hours of looking confirmed what he'd seen in the ballroom and added new complications to the picture. The suspension geometry deviation wasn't localized, it was systematic, front and rear. The rear suspension pickup points showed the same pattern of deliberate alteration, with mounting positions that were inconsistent with any standard production DBS he'd worked on or studied. The frame itself, while severely damaged by fire in several sections, showed additional reinforcement at the structural joints that was clearly factory work. Not add-on welding, not an owner modification, but engineered bracing that had been built into the chassis from the start. Whoever had built this car had built it to handle differently, to distribute load differently, to respond to cornering forces differently than a standard DBS. The engine bay was a ruin. The engine itself had seized in the fire, and several components had melted into each other in ways that made individual identification difficult. But the mounting points, the physical interface between the engine block and the chassis, were in a configuration that Owen had to check 3 times before he was willing to write it down, because the spacing suggested an engine displacement that was meaningfully larger than the standard DBS inline 6. They'd put something bigger in here, or they'd planned to. He found the first piece of documentation on the 3rd day. It was inside the remnants of the right side door panel, which had partially burned but retained its structural integrity, the skin having acted as insulation for the cavity behind it. The document was inside a heat-damaged metal sleeve that might once have been a technical document holder, the kind of thing you see attached to the inside of prototype vehicle doors to hold specification sheets during development testing. The sleeve had deformed in the heat, and opening it required patience and a pair of needle-nose pliers and about 20 minutes of very careful work. What came out was charred around the edges, brittle, and in several places illegible. But it was paper, dense, close-type technical paper. And across the top of the first page, in a header that was still, miraculously, fully readable, were the words, Ashcroft Motors, Experimental Vehicle Program, Unit 003, Internal Document, Restricted Circulation. Owen sat on the concrete floor with the paper in his hands for a long time. Ashcroft Motors. He knew the name. Everyone in the British automotive world knew the name, knew it the way they knew about the other great independent manufacturers who had operated in England in the post-war decades, some of whom had survived, most of whom had not. Ashcroft Motors had been an independent manufacturer of high-performance road and racing vehicles based in Coventry, operating from approximately 1953 until its dissolution in 1971. They had built fewer than 400 vehicles across their entire production run, all of them rare, most of them valuable, and a handful of them, the racing variants and the 1 or 2 prototypes that had entered the historical record, genuinely significant. Owen knew about the experimental vehicle program in the way that a person knows about something they've read about in secondary sources and considered to be an interesting historical footnote. In the early 1960s, Ashcroft had apparently undertaken a development program for a new generation of road car, not a racer, but a road car, that would incorporate lessons from their racing engineering work. The program had, according to the historical accounts Owen had read, been abandoned when the company ran into financial difficulties around 1965 or 1966. No completed vehicles from the program were known to survive. There was a single archival photograph of what appeared to be a development mule in a contemporary trade magazine, reproduced in a collector's book Owen had borrowed from a library 3 years ago. The mule in the photograph didn't look like much. It was an Aston Martin DBS body shell, because Ashcroft had apparently used DBS body shells as the basis for their development work, partly for cost reasons and partly because the DBS had the structural qualities they needed as a starting point, sitting on what was clearly a heavily modified chassis. Owen set the paper down very carefully on a clean section of the workbench. Then he picked up his phone and called Marcus Webb. "I need you to tell me everything you know about Ashcroft Motors," he said, when Marcus picked up. "Owen, it's 7 in the morning." "I know. Tell me about Ashcroft." A pause. Marcus was 61 and had been in the collector car trade for 38 years, and there were very few things in that world that he hadn't at least tangentially encountered. Small British independent, Coventry. Folded in 71. What about them? Their experimental vehicle program. A longer pause. That's very specific. Yeah. Why are you asking me about something that nobody's thought about since approximately 1983? Because, Owen said, I think I'm standing in front of Unit 3, Miss Sat. The next 7 days were the kind of days that Owen would later have difficulty explaining to people who hadn't been there, because the experience of them didn't reduce easily to a clear narrative. He was doing two things simultaneously that normally required entirely different modes of thinking. He was dismantling a fire-damaged vehicle with the methodical patience that mechanical work demanded, and he was also conducting something that could only be described as historical detective work, trying to assemble from fragments and partial records the story of what exactly he had in his garage. He called in favors. He made calls to people he hadn't spoken to in years. A retired automotive historian in Bristol named Graham Alderton, who had written the most comprehensive existing account of British independent manufacturers of the post-war period, and who answered Owen's description of the document with a silence that stretched long enough to become alarming. A parts specialist in London who dealt in historic British vehicles, and who, when Owen described the suspension geometry, said, "That's not possible," and then immediately asked for photographs. And a woman named Dr. Patricia Vance at the National Motor Museum at Beaulieu in Hampshire, who was the foremost academic expert on British prototype vehicle development of the 1960s, and who did not, Owen gathered, typically return calls from mechanics in Virginia on their personal cell phones, but who called him back within 3 hours and talked to him for 45 minutes. "The program was known to exist, Doctor," Vance told him, in the slightly careful voice of someone trying not to get ahead of the evidence. "We have internal Ashcroft documents at the museum that reference it. 3 units were planned. Unit 1 was destroyed during crash testing in 1964. Unit 2, this is in the record, was dismantled, and the parts were used for other projects when the program was discontinued. Unit 3 was listed in the internal documents as status unknown. That was a 1966 entry. After that, nothing." "Nothing," Owen repeated. "Nothing at all. The assumption, the reasonable assumption, given the circumstances, was that it had been scrapped. There was no record of it being sold or transferred. It simply stopped appearing in the paperwork." Owen looked across the garage at the chassis, half dismantled now, parts carefully labeled and laid on the clean drop cloths he'd spread across the floor. "It wasn't scrapped," he said. "No," Dr. Vance said. "Apparently not." He was working 12 and 14-hour days in the garage, which meant that Danny was doing more things by himself than Owen was entirely comfortable with, and that the kitchen was surviving on a rotation of sandwiches, pasta, and the casseroles that Owen's neighbor Ruth Calloway had been bringing over since Danny was 2 years old, when Owen's wife Sarah had left, and which Ruth had never stopped bringing because she was 73 years old and believed that single fathers of young children were constitutionally incapable of eating adequately without outside intervention. Owen didn't argue with her about this because she wasn't entirely wrong. Danny came into the garage in the evenings and did his homework on the workbench, on a section Owen had cleared and covered with a piece of plywood to make a flat surface. He asked occasional questions about what Owen was doing, specific, practical questions, the kind a kid asks when they actually want to know the answer, and Owen answered them the same way he always did, which was directly and without condescension. "What's a prototype?" Danny asked on the fourth evening. "It's a test version," Owen said, carefully working a corroded bolt from the front suspension. When engineers are designing something new, they build one to see if their ideas work before they go ahead and make a lot of them. So it's like a practice one. Exactly like a practice one, except usually the practice one has the most interesting engineering in it, because that's when they're still figuring things out and trying things. The regular production ones are usually simpler. Danny thought about this. So the practice one is better? Sometimes, in its own way, because it's got more thinking in it. Owen looked at his son. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly right. It's got more thinking in it." He found the second document cache on the sixth day, inside the left side sill panel, in another metal sleeve that had been better protected by the surrounding structure. This one was more complete, and it included 3 pages of test data: acceleration curves, handling measurements, recorded observations from a test driver identified only by initials, and a single typed cover sheet that identified the vehicle by its unit number and its internal project designation, and included a sentence in the dry technical language of engineering documentation that Owen read 4 times before he allowed himself to fully process it. Unit 003 represents the final configuration of the EVP development program and incorporates all modifications arising from testing of Units 001 and 002, including revised engine specification, see Appendix C, final suspension geometry, see Appendix B, and full competition specification braking system. Unit 003 is the definitive statement of the program's engineering intentions and is the only surviving unit built to this standard. The only surviving unit built to this standard. Owen set the document down and stood in the garage for a while, listening to the sound of the neighborhood. A dog somewhere, a car on the road outside, the distant noise of someone's television through an open window, and thought about the particular feeling of standing next to something that has been lost for a long time, and is now, through some combination of circumstances that you couldn't have predicted, and choices that you made without fully understanding why, found. He called Graham Alderton again that evening. "I need to know," Owen said, "what this would be worth, if it authenticated." Graham was quiet for a moment. "That depends on the condition of the surviving mechanical components," he said carefully. "I know that. I'm asking hypothetically." "Hypothetically?" Graham sounded like a man choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that some numbers, once said out loud, become real in a way that cannot be undwelt. The only known surviving example of a significant British developmental prototype from a manufacturer with a small but passionate collector following, documented with provenance. Hypothetically, Owen, you would be talking about the kind of number that people outside of the collector world find difficult to believe, and the kind of number that people inside the collector world find difficult to say without first making sure they're sitting down. "Give me a range," Owen said. Another pause. "With full authentication and in the right market. 7 figures is a floor, not a ceiling." Owen didn't say anything. "Are you sitting down?" Graham asked. "No," Owen said. "You should probably sit down." Chid. The calls started coming in on the 8th day. He still didn't fully understand how the word had gotten out. Later, he'd pieced together that it had moved through a chain of conversations, that Dr. Vance had mentioned it to a colleague, that the colleague had mentioned it to someone in the trade press, that someone in the trade press had mentioned it to a private dealer. But however it traveled fast. The first call was from a collector in Munich named Friedrich Bauer, who was polite and businesslike and offered Owen $400,000 before Owen had said anything more than hello. Owen told him he wasn't selling anything yet. Of course, Friedrich said, in the tone of someone who has been told no enough times to know that no sometimes means not yet. "You'll call me when you're ready." The second call was from a private museum in California that specialized in British automotive history and which was willing, the director told Owen, to make an acquisition offer at any stage of the restoration process, condition as is. The third call was from a woman named Celeste Harmon, who represented a group of private investors who collected historically significant vehicles as a portfolio asset and who asked Owen, with great casualness, what his absolute minimum price would be if a decision needed to be made quickly. "I don't have one yet," Owen said. "Everyone has one," she said. "Not everyone," Owen said, and hung up. He was on the phone with Terrell, who was helping him source a specific kind of structural welding rod for a section of frame repair, when the doorbell rang on the 9th evening. Danny answered it. He was under strict instructions to check who it was before opening the door, which he did by standing on the front step couch and looking out the window, and came to get Owen in the garage with an expression that was trying not to look impressed and not entirely succeeding. "Lady at the door," Danny said. "Really nice car." Owen wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked through the house to the front door. Vivian Ashcroft was standing on his front porch. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, which was apparently her version of casual, and she had the poised, assembled quality of someone who was accustomed to controlling the environment around her and was working to maintain that impression in a setting that was actively resisting her. Behind her on the street, a black Mercedes S-Class sat at the curb with its parking lights on, and Owen could see the shape of a driver in the front seat. She looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Granger," she said. "My name is—" "I know who you are," Owen said. A small adjustment in her expression. Not quite surprise, but something in the vicinity of it. She was clearly accustomed to being the one who already knew everything. "May I come in?" Owen stepped back from the doorway. She came into the living room, which had Danny's solar system project on the coffee table and a pair of sneakers near the door and a stack of automotive trade magazines on the chair by the window, and she looked around it with the same efficient, processing attention that Owen imagined she brought to everything. She did not make any effort to comment on the room, which Owen appreciated more than he would have expected. "I'll get to the point," she said. "I think we both know what you've found." "I think you know what I've found," Owen said. "Whether you know what it means is a separate question." Something shifted slightly in her expression at that. Not offense exactly, but something more complicated. "We sold you something we shouldn't have put on the auction floor. That was our mistake." "It was your call," Owen said. "I read the catalog." "Yes." She held his gaze steadily. "It was my call, and I'm here to offer you $5 million to buy it back." The number sat in the room between them. Owen was aware of Danny somewhere behind him in the kitchen. The sound of a chair scraping on linoleum, the specific acoustic of a kid pretending not to be listening. "That's a lot of money," Owen said. "It is," Vivian agreed, "and the offer stands for the next 72 hours, after which the authentication process will be far enough along that the story will be public and the figure becomes complicated." Owen looked at her. He thought about the document he'd found in the SIL panel, with its dry technical language and its sentence about Unit 003 being the definitive statement of the program's engineering intentions. He thought about the test data, about the suspension geometry, about the engine mounting points, about all the thinking that had gone into this car by people who were now dead and whose work had sat in a burning storage facility outside Roanoke, Virginia for 18 months, and before that had sat somewhere else unknown for somewhere between 40 and 50 years, waiting. "No," he said. Vivian didn't react immediately. She held still for a moment in the way that people hold still when they're deciding how to respond to something they didn't expect. "Mr. Granger, I appreciate you coming in person," Owen said, "and I understand that this is an uncomfortable situation, but the answer is no." She looked at him for another moment, then she nodded, a single, precise nod that conveyed something that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite acceptance, but was in the vicinity of both. "You'll have other offers," she said. "I know. Some of them will be less straightforward than mine." "I know that too." She picked up her bag from where she'd set it on the chair, moving the automotive magazine aside without comment, and walked back toward the front door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "What did you see?" she asked. "At the auction, that I didn't." Owen thought about how to answer that. The suspension, he said, the geometry was off. She was quiet for a moment. I stood in front of that car for 20 minutes during the preview, she said. I didn't see it. You weren't looking for it. What were you looking for? I wasn't looking for anything specific, Owen said. I was just looking. She left without another word. Owen stood in the doorway and watched the Mercedes pull away from the curb, its taillights shrinking as it turned at the end of the block. Danny appeared at his elbow. $5 million, he said, in the tone of someone confirming information they'd overheard. Yeah, Owen said, and you said no. Yeah. Danny was quiet for a moment, processing this with the deliberate seriousness he applied to significant information. Because it's worth more? Owen looked down at him. Yeah, buddy, it's worth more. Danny nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer in a way that Owen found oddly moving, the simple, uncomplicated faith of a kid who trusted that his father knew what he was doing, even when the evidence was ambiguous. Can we work on Saturn tonight? Danny asked. Yeah, Owen said. Let's work on Saturn. They went inside. The DBS sat in the garage under the fluorescent lights, patient and broken and extraordinary, waiting for whatever came next. Saturn turned out to have a wobble problem. Danny had threaded the wire through the foam ball at a slightly off-center angle, which meant that when the whole solar system model was assembled and hung from the dowel rod, Saturn rotated unevenly and listed about 15 degrees to the left every time it caught a breeze. Danny stood back and stared at it with the particular expression he wore when something wasn't right, and he was deciding whether to pretend it was. It's fine, he said. It's crooked, Owen said. Okay. It's a little crooked. We can fix it. 20 minutes. Danny exhaled with the weight of someone being asked to revisit a completed chapter of his life. Fine. They fixed it. Owen held the ball steady while Danny rethreaded the wire, and they hung it back on the dowel and stood back together and looked at it. And this time Saturn hung straight, and the whole system turned slowly in the air from the kitchen ceiling fan with something that was not quite beauty, but was close to it. The orderly, improvised beauty of a thing made by hands on a kitchen table on a Sunday night. Better, Danny said. Yeah, Owen agreed. Better. It was, Owen would later think, one of the last ordinary evenings for a while. The calls had not stopped after Vivian's visit. If anything, they had intensified, word moving through the collector world the way significant news always moves, in expanding circles that get less accurate and more dramatic with each pass. By the 10th day after the auction, Owen's phone had logged contacts from a private dealer in Geneva, an automotive museum director in Stuttgart, a representative for an unnamed buyer in Tokyo, and a man who introduced himself only as a consultant for a group of interested parties, and who spoke with the careful, oblique vocabulary of someone who had spent a career saying things without quite saying them. Owen talked to the ones who seemed legitimate. He was polite with everyone. He sold nothing and committed to nothing, which frustrated people who were accustomed to the language of transactions going a certain predictable way once the numbers got large enough. The authentication process was underway, running parallel to Owen's continued work on the disassembly. Dr. Vance had connected him with a formal authentication specialist, a meticulous, dry-humored man named Arthur Covington, who flew in from London and spent 2 days in Owen's garage with a camera, a measuring kit, a laptop full of archival reference material, and a thermos of tea that he refilled from Owen's kettle without asking, which Owen found completely reasonable. Covington moved around the vehicle with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that being wrong about something like this was a career-defining failure in the worst direction. The document provenance is strong, Covington said, on the second afternoon, crouched next to the sill panel with a magnifying loupe. The paper stock is period consistent. The typeface and formatting match Ashcroft's internal documentation style from the early to mid-60s. I've compared it against 3 authenticated examples from the Beaulieu archive. And the chassis? Owen asked. Covington stood up slowly with the slightly effortful quality of a man whose knees had logged too many years on concrete floors and were making their objections known. The chassis is the strongest element. The structural modifications are clearly original. They're integrated into the primary construction, not retrofitted. The welds are period-correct metallurgically, and the reinforcement geometry is consistent with what you'd expect from an engineering team trying to solve a specific handling problem. He looked at Owen evenly. You know what you have. I have a pretty good idea, Owen said. A pretty good idea isn't going to be sufficient for what comes next, Covington said, not unkindly. Get a solicitor. Owen didn't have a solicitor. He had a woman named Jean Fogarty, who had handled his small business filing for 6 years, and who was efficient and no-nonsense and whose office was above a dry cleaner on Main Street in Culpeper, but who was not, Owen was fairly certain, equipped for whatever this was becoming. He made a mental note to ask Graham Alderton for a referral, then forgot about it for 2 days because there were parts to catalog and calls to field, and Danny had a stomach bug that lasted 48 hours and required the kind of full parental deployment that left no mental bandwidth for anything else. On day 11, Owen was in the garage at 7 in the morning. Danny still asleep, the neighborhood quiet, the light coming through the high window at a long morning angle that made even the burned metal look almost gentle, when he heard a car stop outside. Not at the curb, in the driveway. He set down the measuring caliper he'd been using and wiped his hands and walked to the garage's side door and looked out. It was a silver Range Rover, and the man getting out of it was not someone Owen recognized. He was maybe 50, with the particular physical confidence of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in whatever room he was in. He was wearing a coat that cost more than Owen's truck and holding a phone that he pocketed before he'd finished closing the car door. He saw Owen and stopped. Mr. Granger, he said. No introduction, just the name, delivered as though that was sufficient. That's me, Owen said. Who are you? My name is Fletcher Drummond. I represent a private acquisition group. He said it like someone reciting a credential that should, by rights, open doors. We have a significant interest in the vehicle you currently have in your possession. Significant meaning what exactly? Drummond smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind designed to project warmth without actually requiring any. Significant meaning we are prepared to move quickly and generously to resolve this situation before it becomes complicated. Owen leaned against the door frame and looked at him. It's already complicated. It doesn't need to be. Drummond reached into his coat and produced a folded document, a single sheet, printed, which he held out toward Owen. This is a letter of intent. The figure is $8 million, payable within 30 days of a signed agreement. No auction, no press, no extended authentication process. Clean and quiet. Owen didn't take the paper. Clean and quiet, he repeated. These situations can become untidy, Drummond said. There are parties who would prefer to avoid the public attention that comes with a major auction event. This is a mutually beneficial arrangement. Owen was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter of intent still extended in Drummond's hand, which was not shaking but was being held with the slightly rigid quality of someone who had expected a different reaction by now. Who are the parties? Owen asked. I'm not at liberty to consider it, Owen said. Thanks for coming by. Drummond lowered the paper slowly. The practiced warmth in his expression didn't disappear exactly, but it reorganized itself into something cooler and more candid. Mr. Granger, $8 million is a number that ends financial worry. For most people in your situation, that's a conversation worth having. I'm having a conversation, Owen said. It's going badly for you. Something crossed Drummond's face that might have been respect if it hadn't dissolved back into professional neutrality quite so quickly. He pocketed the letter, got back in the Range Rover, and left. Owen stood in the doorway for a moment after the car was gone. He thought about the phrase, your situation, and the way Drummond had used it, the way people sometimes deploy accurate information as a form of pressure, counting on you to feel the weight of what's true. He was a single father with a modest garage in a rented house and a truck with 180,000 miles on it and a kid who needed braces in about 2 years. That was his situation, and Drummond had assessed it correctly. $8 million was a number that ended financial worry. The problem was that it was also a number that someone had decided Owen should accept before the authentication was complete, before the story was public, before the full range of interested parties had a chance to know what they were bidding on. And people only did that when they knew the thing was worth more than what they were offering. Owen went back inside to make coffee before Danny woke up. He also called Graham Alderton and asked for that solicitor referral. The solicitor's name was Diana Mercer, and she was based in D.C. and specialized in high-value asset transactions and intellectual property. Graham had worked with her on 2 previous significant fines and described her as someone who was incapable of being pressured into anything, which is either admirable or frightening depending on which side of the table you're on. She drove down to Culpeper on a Thursday afternoon and sat at Owen's kitchen table drinking coffee and listening to him talk for 40 minutes without interrupting, and then asked 15 questions in rapid succession with the focused efficiency of someone building a structure in their head as they went. "Okay," she said when she'd finished her questions. "Who else knows the full story at this point?" "Covington, Dr. Vance, Graham, Terrell, my part-time guy, but he doesn't know the details, just that it's significant." "Any press?" "Not yet. There's been something moving through the collector trade community, but nothing in print." Diana looked at her notes. "Drummond's offer worries me more than Ashcroft's offer," she said, "because he wouldn't say who he was working for. Because anonymous buyers making below-market pre-authentication offers on potentially significant fines have a specific profile," she said. "They're either speculating, which is fine, but still undervalues you, or they have information about provenance complications that they're not disclosing, and they want to acquire cheaply before that information surfaces." She tapped her pen against the table. "I want to know if there's a legal question around the Ashcroft connection." "The car was built by Ashcroft Motors," Owen said. "The company dissolved in 1971. "I know the company dissolved. I'm asking about the Ashcroft family's connection to the auction house." She looked at him steadily. "Vivian Ashcroft's grandfather founded Ashcroft Motors. The auction house, Ashcroft Automotive Legacy, was founded by the same family. It's not a coincidence of names." Owen set down his coffee mug. He had known this, on some level, had registered the name connection without fully thinking through the implications. "She sold the car from her own auction house," he said slowly. "She sold a car that may have significant historic connection to her family's original manufacturing business from her own auction house for $100, Diana said. "Now, I'm not saying she knew what it was. I genuinely don't know, and you probably don't know either. But from a legal positioning standpoint, there's a question there that I need to get in front of before someone else does." "She said it was a mistake," Owen said. "When she came here, she said they'd sold something they shouldn't have put on the floor." "She said that after you already had it." "Yeah." Diana wrote something in her notepad. "Tell me about the storage facility fire, the estate from which the auction house acquired the car." Owen told her what he knew, which wasn't much. The Fitch estate sale, the Roanoke facility, the fire 18 months before Fitch's death. Diana wrote notes. "I need the acquisition documentation from Ashcroft's intake process," she said. "Their internal records on how they categorized and assessed this vehicle before putting it in the catalog. If they had professional assessors who missed the significance, that's one thing. If they had assessors who didn't properly assess it, that's another. If they had any assessors at all." "How do you get that?" She looked at him with the flat patience of someone who has been asked obvious questions for a long time. "I asked them for it." She sent the letter to Ashcroft Automotive Legacy the following morning. The response came in 4 days, which Diana told Owen in a brief phone call was fast. Which told you something. The response was polite and professional and provided the requested documentation without apparent resistance. Diana went through it carefully and called Owen back 2 hours later. "They had one assessor look at it," she said, 30-year industry veteran. "His assessment report has 2 paragraphs on condition and 1 line about provenance. No significant historical documentation, VIN, partially damaged, sold as is." He looked at it for 45 minutes. 45 minutes, Owen said. "I spent 400 hours in med school on a single anatomy unit," Diana said. 45 minutes on a vehicle with a partially destroyed VIN and no documentation is not a thorough assessment, but it's also not necessarily negligent by industry standards." She paused. "What I can tell you is that Vivian Ashcroft signed off on the auction listing personally. The catalog entry is under her approval signature." Owen digested this. She knew it was something. "I think she suspected it might be something and chose not to pursue it," Diana said carefully. Whether that's the same as knowing, legally, is a question I'm not going to answer for you over the phone. Is there a legal claim against the auction house, against her? That depends on a lot of things I don't know yet. What I can tell you is that you're not in a vulnerable position. You purchased the vehicle legally at public auction for the listed price. You own it. No one can take it from you. A brief pause. What I'd recommend is that you don't make any public statements about the Ashcroft family connection until we know more. Right now, you have all the leverage. Don't give any of it away by accident. Owen said he understood. He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the house. Danny was at school. The garage was quiet. Outside, the November light was thin and gray and honest, the kind of light that doesn't make anything prettier than it is. He walked out to the garage and stood next to the DBS. In the 10 days since the auction, it had been transformed from a burned wreck into something more recognizable as a subject of serious attention. The burned body panels removed and cataloged, the chassis exposed and clean, the surviving mechanical components carefully separated and labeled on the drop cloths. Arthur Covington had photographed every square inch of it. It looked less like a car now and more like an argument, a technical argument made in steel and alloy about what a car could be, if you built it with enough ambition and enough patience and enough willingness to throw out what you already knew. Owen crouched down next to the front suspension and looked at the geometry again. He'd looked at it so many times now that he could see it with his eyes closed. The precise, deliberate deviation from standard, the engineering logic underneath it. He thought about the test driver who had recorded observations in the documents, the unnamed person who had driven this vehicle on some track or road in England in 1964 or 1965 and written down what it did under their hands. He thought about what it must have been like to drive something that nobody had driven before, to be the first person to feel what a new machine was capable of. He heard the garage door and looked up. Terrell was standing in the doorway, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the chassis. Terrell was 22 and hadn't been told the full story, but he wasn't oblivious. He'd seen the calls come in, seen the documentation spread across the workbench, noticed the London specialist spending 2 days with a measuring kit. He had the specific alertness of a smart young person who is aware that significant things are happening around them and is trying to calibrate how much to ask. "Bigger than I thought," he said. Owen stood up. "Yeah." Terrell nodded slowly, taking in the exposed chassis, the labeled components, the careful arrangement of everything. "You need help. I can put in more hours." "Not yet." Owen looked at him. "Soon, maybe." "You're going to restore it?" Terrell asked. "Actually restore it?" It was a reasonable question. The authentic restoration of a vehicle like this, correct to its original specification, using period-appropriate techniques and materials, was a project of extraordinary scope and difficulty, requiring knowledge and resources that went well beyond Owen's normal work. It was also, Diana had explained, likely to significantly affect the vehicle's ultimate value. A properly authenticated, properly restored Ashcroft EVP prototype was a different proposition from a properly authenticated but fire-damaged chassis. "I don't know yet," Owen said honestly. "Depends on a few things." "What things?" "What it turns out to be worth. What makes sense." He paused. "What the right thing to do with it is." Terrell absorbed this. He was quiet for a moment in the way that young people are quiet when they're deciding whether to say something they've been thinking about. "My grandfather restored cars," he said finally. "Old ones. Not valuable ones, just cars that other people had given up on. He used to say that a car isn't really saved until it can drive again. Everything else is just storage." Owen looked at the chassis. "Your grandfather was right," he said. That afternoon, Owen got a call from a number he didn't recognize with a London area code. He almost didn't pick it up. The volume of unknown calls had made him selective, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end was older, a man's voice, with an English accent and the slightly tentative quality of someone who was calling because they felt they ought to, not because they were comfortable doing it. "Is this Owen Granger, the mechanic in Virginia?" "It is," Owen said. "My name is Robert Aldis. I'm 91 years old, and I was the chief development engineer for Ashcroft Motors from 1958 until the company closed." A pause. "I understand you may have found Unit 3. Owen sat down on the shop stool. "Mr. Aldous," he said carefully. "How did you—" "Graham Alderton rang me," the old man said. "We've known each other for years. He thought I should know." Another pause, shorter this time. "I need you to understand that I never thought it was still out there. I genuinely believed it had been destroyed." "What happened to it?" Owen asked. "In 1966, when the program ended." Robert Aldous was quiet for a long moment. The silence had the particular quality of someone reaching back a very long time into a memory that had things in it that still mattered. "We ran out of money," he said simply. The way small companies always run out of money, gradually and then very suddenly. The program director decided that continuing development didn't make commercial sense. We were told to document everything and shut down the work. A pause. "I was 29 years old. I'd spent 3 years of my life on that program. When they told us to shut it down, I arranged for Unit 3 to be transported to a private storage arrangement, unofficially, without authorization." He said the last words with the careful precision of a very old man who has spent decades deciding how to characterize a decision made when he was very young. "I didn't want it destroyed. I thought, someday someone would care about it. I paid for the storage out of my own salary for several years. Then I lost track of it. I moved. The storage company changed hands. I tried to find it again in the 1980s and couldn't." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I think you deserve to know the full history of what you have." Owen turned this over in his mind, looking at the chassis in front of him. "Does this affect the ownership?" he asked. "Legally. You're having moved it without authorization." "No," Aldous said with surprising firmness. "Ashcroft Motors dissolved. The assets were liquidated. Anything that wasn't accounted for in the liquidation simply ceased to have a legal owner. The vehicle you bought was legally ownerless, technically abandoned property, which is presumably why the auction house was able to include it in their catalog without complications." A dry, thin note in his voice. "They clearly didn't know what they had." "No," Owen agreed. "They didn't." "You did," Aldous said. "How?" Owen thought about the suspension, the geometry, the way he'd stood in the back of the ballroom and just looked at it while everyone around him was looking through it. "I was looking for the right things," he said. "And what are you going to do with it now?" It was the same question Terrell had asked, in a different form. Owen looked at the chassis, at the deliberate engineering in its bones, at the shape of all the thinking that had gone into it. He thought about Aldous, but 29 years old, using his own salary to keep something alive that nobody else thought was worth keeping, because he couldn't bear to watch it be destroyed. He thought about Danny's solar system hanging from the kitchen ceiling, Saturn finally straight. "I'm gonna do it right," Owen said, "whatever that turns out to mean." The old man on the other end of the line was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a quality that Owen couldn't name precisely, but recognized. The quality of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down. "Good," Robert Aldous said. "That's good." Robert Aldous died 11 days after that phone call. Owen found out through Graham Alderton, who called on a Tuesday morning while Owen was in the garage cataloging suspension components. Graham's voice had the careful, subdued quality of someone delivering news they'd been sitting with for a few hours before they felt ready to pass it along. "He was 91, Graham said. He'd been ill for a while. His daughter told me she said he seemed lighter the last few days, like something had resolved." A pause. "I think talking to you did that." Owen set down the caliper he'd been holding. He looked at the chassis in front of him, at the suspension geometry that Robert Aldous had spent 3 years designing, that he'd spent his own salary protecting, that had sat in a burning storage facility outside Roanoke, and then in a luxury ballroom, and then in Owen's garage, traveling a long, improbable distance to arrive here. "I'm glad he knew," Owen said. "His daughter wants to send you something, documents, personal notes from the program years. She said he kept them in a box under his bed for 60 years. "Tell her yes," Owen said immediately. "I already did." After he hung up, Owen stood in the garage for a while without doing anything in particular. The November light was coming through the high window at its long angle, and outside he could hear a neighbor's leaf blower starting up, and then, a few minutes later, stopping. He thought about being 29 years old and watching something you'd built get scheduled for destruction, and making the choice Aldous had made. The quiet, unauthorized, stubborn choice to keep it alive anyway. He thought about the 40-odd years of storage fees, and then lost contact, and then decades of not knowing. He thought that 91 years was long enough to find out. The box arrived from England 4 days later, shipped by Aldous's daughter in a sturdy cardboard carton, with careful packing and a handwritten note tucked inside the lid that said simply, "He would have wanted these to go with the car. Thank you for finding it. Margaret Aldous." Owen read the note twice, set it on the workbench, and spent the next 2 evenings going through the contents with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. What was in the box was 58 years of a careful man's professional life, filtered through the specific obsession of someone who knew he'd done something that mattered and couldn't entirely let go of it. There were engineering notebooks in Aldous's precise, small handwriting. There were original technical drawings, hand-drafted, on paper that had gone brittle at the folds but remained fully legible, showing suspension geometries and chassis reinforcement layouts and engine mounting configurations, all of it labeled with dimensions and material specifications. There were internal memos from the Ashcroft Motors development team, including a series of increasingly terse exchanges about program budget overruns that ended abruptly in mid-1965, the paper record of a project running out of road. There were photographs, black and white, taken on a test track that Owen didn't recognize, showing the vehicle in early development configurations, and one photograph that stopped Owen cold. Unit 3 on a track somewhere, the DBS body sitting low over the modified chassis, a young man in a jacket and open-collared shirt leaning against the front wing with his arms crossed, looking at the camera with the particular expression of someone who has just been told the project is being canceled. Owen looked at that photograph for a long time. The young man in the picture was Robert Aldous at 29. He had the same expression Owen imagined he would have had. Not devastated, not resigned, but something more complicated than either. The expression of someone deciding something. Arthur Covington's formal authentication report arrived the following week. Diana called Owen the morning it landed. "It's thorough," she said. 18 pages. He's confident. The chassis designation, the engineering modifications, the document provenance, the metallurgical dating. Everything is consistent with Ashcroft Motors experimental program production, 1963 to 1965. He's classifying it as an authenticated one-of-one surviving example. She paused. He also included a section on the Aldous documents, which he'd heard about through Patricia Vance. He says they strengthen the provenance significantly. Strengthen how? Hand-drafted technical drawings signed by the chief development engineer with dimensions that match the physical vehicle to within manufacturing tolerances. That's not circumstantial. That's a direct chain of custody from the designer's hand to the metal in your garage. Owen sat with that for a moment. "What happens now?" he asked, though he had a reasonable idea. "Now," Diana said, "we decide how to take it to market. And I'd strongly recommend we decide quickly, because I got a call this morning from a journalist at Automotive Heritage Quarterly who has heard that an authenticated Ashcroft prototype has surfaced in Virginia, and who would like a comment." "What did you tell them?" "That my client has no comment at this time, and that any further inquiry should be directed to my office." A brief pause. "We have maybe 2 weeks before this is public regardless of what we do. Probably less." The conversation about how to take it to market was, as Diana had implied, not a simple one. Owen spent 3 evenings at his kitchen table with Diana on speakerphone and a yellow legal pad in front of him, working through options. Private sale to a single buyer. Negotiated acquisition by a museum or institution. A controlled auction process with qualified registered bidders. Each option had its own logic, its own risks, its own timeline. "What do you want?" Diana asked him on the 3rd evening. "That's not usually how these conversations go, is it?" "It's always how they should go," she said. "Most people just skip it because they're too focused on the number." Owen looked at the legal pad. He'd written numbers in the margins, figures that various parties had mentioned, figures that Graham and Covington had suggested as reference points, Numbers that would change his life in ways he was still not entirely able to process. "I want it to go somewhere it'll be taken care of," he said. "That matters to me." "More than the number?" "I didn't say that." He tapped the pen against the pad. "But it's part of the number. If I sell it to someone who sticks it in a warehouse, I'm going to feel that for the rest of my life. I want that to be a factor." Diana was quiet for a moment. "That's actually a useful negotiating position," she said. "Seriously, buyers who intend to properly display and preserve a vehicle will pay more for the credibility of being the seller's chosen custodian. Reputation in this world has real monetary value." "I didn't mean it as a strategy," Owen said. "I know. That's what makes it effective." They were still working through the framework when the story broke. It wasn't the journalist from Automotive Heritage Quarterly who published first. It was a collectors' forum, one of those dense, enthusiast-run online communities where people who know too much about very specific things gather to know it at each other. Where someone who had heard something from someone who had heard something posted a thread that was initially skeptical and became, over the course of about 18 hours, increasingly specific and increasingly confident. By the time Owen woke up on a Thursday morning, the thread had 400 replies, Diana had 17 missed calls, and his own phone had logged 22 new contacts, including 3 from journalists, 2 from television producers, 1 from a documentary filmmaker in London, and 1 from a number that turned out to belong to a major American business magazine. Danny found him at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand and his coffee going cold, reading through the forum thread on his laptop. Danny poured himself cereal and sat down across from him. "Is it happening?" Danny asked. He had absorbed enough of the situation over the past weeks to have a general understanding of its shape, if not its details. "Yeah," Owen said. "It's happening." "The big thing?" "The big thing." Danny ate his cereal and looked at the laptop screen. "Are you scared?" Owen considered this honestly, the way he always tried to answer Danny's direct questions honestly. "A little," he said. "It's a lot of noise coming at once." "You're good at ignoring noise," Danny said. "How do you know that?" Danny looked at him with the expression he used when Owen asked a question that he considered to have an obvious answer. "Because you didn't sell it for $5 million to that lady who came here." Owen looked at his son. "Yeah," he said. "I guess that's true." Diana managed the incoming contacts with the brisk efficiency of someone who had handled media situations before and found them tedious but navigable. She issued a brief statement confirming that an authenticated Ashcroft Motors experimental vehicle program prototype had been legally acquired at public auction and was in private ownership, and that further information would be made available through an official press release at an appropriate time. She declined all interview requests. She redirected the documentary filmmaker to Owen's phone. Owen called the man back and spent 20 minutes talking to him and came away from the conversation with the feeling that it might be worth continuing at some later point when the dust had settled. The press release went out on a Monday morning, 2 weeks after the forum thread broke the story. It had been drafted by Diana and reviewed by Covington and read carefully by Owen 3 times before he approved it. It was precise and restrained and factual, which was Diana's preferred register and also Owen's, and it said what needed to be said without embellishment: the vehicle's designation, its history, the authentication status, the provenance chain from Aldis's documented engineering work through its decades of storage to its current location, the involvement of the National Motor Museum at Beaulieu in the authentication process, and a statement confirming that the owner was considering options for sale to a qualified buyer who could ensure appropriate preservation and display. The reaction was immediate and larger than Owen had quite prepared himself for. The collector world detonated. That was the word Graham used when he called that afternoon. Detonated. And it was accurate. By end of day Monday, Diana had received formal expressions of interest from 11 parties. 4 private collectors, 3 institutional buyers, including 2 museums and 1 private automotive foundation, 2 investment groups, and 1 party who declined to identify themselves beyond the name of their legal representation, which Diana recognized as a firm that had represented several major private collections in Europe. The offers ranged from $8 million, Drummond's group apparently still interested, to 14 million, which came from the Automotive Foundation and arrived in the form of a detailed letter outlining their preservation and display intentions, which Owen read twice and set aside carefully. Vivian Ashcroft called Owen directly. He almost didn't pick up. He'd been walking from the garage to the house, hands in his jacket pockets against the November cold, when his phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. He stood in the driveway and looked at it for 2 full rings before he answered. "Mr. Granger," she said. "Ms. Ashcroft." A brief pause. "I imagine you've had a significant few days." "You could say that." "I wanted—" She stopped, started again, which was notable because she had not struck Owen as someone who started sentences over. "I wanted to call before things got more complicated than they already are. Not to make an offer. I know you know what you have now, and the 5 million figure was inadequate, and I knew it was inadequate when I offered it, and I'd rather not pretend otherwise." Owen was quiet for a moment, standing in his cold driveway, watching his breath. "Then why are you calling?" "Because I want to say something to you directly, before lawyers and press releases make it impossible to say things directly." Another pause. "I knew that car was something, not what it was. I genuinely didn't know that, but I knew it wasn't nothing. I had a feeling when I stood in front of it during the preview, and I filed that feeling away and approved the $100 opening bid anyway because the assessment report gave me cover to do it, and because I was tired that week, and the estate acquisition had been complicated, and I told myself that my feeling was just that I was projecting." A flat, honest pause. "I wasn't projecting." Owen processed this. "You're telling me you suspected it was significant and put it on the floor anyway." "I'm telling you that I let myself believe something convenient rather than follow an instinct that would have required more work." She said it with the clipped precision of someone reading a sentence they've rehearsed, but still find unpleasant. "I think you deserve to know that. Whatever Diana Mercer decides to do with it legally is a separate matter." "That's a remarkable thing to admit." "It's an accurate thing. I prefer accurate." A brief pause that might, in a different tone, have been a rueful sound. "You noticed what I didn't, because you looked at it the way it deserved to be looked at. I looked at it the way I needed it to be." Owen stood in his driveway for a moment, looking at the garage door. Through the gap at the bottom, he could see the thin line of fluorescent light, the chassis still in there, patient, waiting. "What do you want from this call, Ms. Ashcroft?" "Nothing," she said. "I just wanted you to have the truth from me before you got a version of it from someone else." He believed her, which surprised him somewhat. "Okay," he said. "I appreciate that." "Good luck with the sale," she said, and hung up. Owen stood in the driveway for another moment after the call ended. The cold was settling into his jacket, and he could see his breath, and somewhere down the street a car went by too fast for the neighborhood. He went inside and stood at the kitchen counter and drank a glass of water and thought about what Vivian had said, about looking at something the way you needed it to be rather than the way it was, about convenience as a substitute for attention. He thought it was probably the most honest thing anyone had said to him in months, and he thought that saying it, knowing it would change nothing in her favor and might change something against her, had cost her something real. The formal acquisition process began the following week, with Diana running a structured negotiation that she described to Owen as a controlled auction, not a public event, but a private process in which qualified buyers submitted offers with attached preservation and display commitments that would be evaluated alongside the financial figures. The framework was Owen's idea, originating from what he'd told Diana about wanting the car to go somewhere it would be taken care of, and Diana had built it into a contractual requirement. Any buyer would be legally required to display the vehicle in a publicly accessible context within 18 months of acquisition and maintain it in authenticated condition. The process was not clean. Clean was not the right word for anything that involved 7-figure numbers and competing institutional interests and legal review of preservation commitments by 3 separate sets of lawyers. It was complicated and occasionally frustrating, and there were 2 days in the middle week where an offer from one of the European parties collapsed over a dispute about insurance valuation methodology that Diana explained to Owen at some length, and which he followed only partially but trusted her to handle, which she did. Terrell came in during that middle week and helped Owen complete the detailed condition documentation that Covington needed for the final authentication addendum. Photographs of every remaining mechanical component, measurements of every structural element, a comprehensive record of the fire damage and its extent. It was painstaking work that required 2 people and 4 full days. They worked mostly in silence, with the radio on low, and Terrell asked careful, specific questions about the engineering when something caught his eye, and Owen answered them. "This suspension," Terrell said on the second day, crouched next to the front subframe with his phone camera. "The geometry, what does it actually do? On the road?" "It keeps the tires more perpendicular to the road surface through cornering," Owen said. "Standard production cars compromise on that because manufacturing tolerances are wider and costs matter. When you build a one-off development vehicle and you can machine everything precisely, you can run geometries that production lines can't hold. The car would have had significantly more mechanical grip in high-speed corners than a standard DBS. Better weight transfer under braking." He paused. Aldis's notes describe a test driver who said it felt like the car was thinking ahead of him. Terrell looked at the suspension for a moment. 60 years ago, he said. "They figured this out 60 years ago." "And then the money ran out," Owen said. Terrell was quiet for a moment. That's kind of a sad story, underneath the big story." "A lot of the best engineering stories are," Owen said. "The formal offers, when they came in at the end of the structured process, ranged from $11 million to $19.5 million. Diana presented them to Owen on a Saturday morning at his kitchen table, printed and organized in a folder, with her notes on each party's preservation commitment attached. $19.5 million came from a private collector in Switzerland named Hartmann, who was 67 years old, had one of the largest private collections of historic British vehicles in Europe, had built a climate-controlled museum facility on his estate outside Zurich that was open to the public 3 days a week, and whose preservation commitment was detailed and specific and had been reviewed by 2 independent conservation specialists that Diana had retained for exactly this purpose. Both specialists had given it a high credibility rating. The $14 million offer from the Automotive Foundation was still on the table. Their preservation commitment was also strong. An established institution, public display, educational programming. Their figure was $5.5 million lower. Owen sat with the folder for a long time. Danny was at a friend's house. The kitchen was quiet. He made another coffee he didn't really need and sat back down and looked at the numbers. $19.5 million. He said it to himself once, quietly, in the empty kitchen, just to hear what it sounded like out loud. It sounded like a number from a different world. It sounded like the end of one kind of life and the beginning of another kind, and the gap between those 2 things was both exciting and frightening in approximately equal measure, and he sat with both of those feelings without trying to resolve them. He called Graham Alderton. "Walk me through the Hartmann collection," he said. "What do you actually know about him?" Graham spent 20 minutes doing exactly that. He knew Hartmann tangentially, had dealt with his acquisitions people twice, had visited the Zurich facility once on a research trip. His assessment was measured and specific in the way that Graham's assessments always were. "He's serious," Graham said finally. "He's not a speculator. He's not buying it to hold it in a container. He wants it because he understands what it is." "Does he know about Aldis? The full story?" "I made sure his people had the documentation, yes." Owen looked out the kitchen window at the bare November trees, the light flat and gray, and the foundation. "Also serious, different kind of serious, more institutional, more committee-driven, which means more durable in some ways and more bureaucratic in others. But their track record on preservation is excellent." A pause. "This is genuinely a decision about what matters to you, Owen. Both outcomes are good for the car." "One outcome is $5.5 million better for me." "Yes," Graham said simply. "It is." Owen sat with that honesty for a moment. He thought about Danny's braces. He thought about the garage and what he might do with it, and what Terrell might be able to do if Owen had the resources to actually build something worth building. He thought about Ruth Calloway's casseroles and the mortgage on the house he didn't own and the truck with 180,000 miles on it. "Okay," he said. "Tell me what the right process is." Diana ran a final round, going back to the top 5 bidders with the last and final request. The process took 4 days. On the fifth day, she called Owen at 8 in the morning. Hartman's at 20 million, she said. The foundation came up to 16. The other three are below both. $20 million. His preservation commitment? Owen asked. Unchanged from the original submission. If anything, he added specificity. He's committed to displaying it as a centerpiece of a planned Ashcroft Motors retrospective exhibition in consultation with the National Motor Museum at Beaulieu. He's proposing to name the gallery after the program. A pause. He also sent a personal letter. I'm forwarding it now. Owen opened the letter on his phone. It was 2 paragraphs, written in English that was precise and slightly formal in the way of someone who speaks English fluently, but not as their first language. It said that Hartman had been aware of the Ashcroft experimental vehicle program since he was a young man, that he had read every available account of it, that he had in his collection 2 authenticated Ashcroft production vehicles that had been in his family for decades. It said that Unit 3 was not, in his view, simply a rare vehicle. It was the completion of something that had been interrupted, and that he intended to treat it accordingly. It said, in the final sentence, I cannot promise you that I will live long enough to see everything I intend for it, but I can promise you that the people who come after me will know exactly what it is and why it matters. Owen read the letter twice. Then he called Diana back. Accept Hartman's offer, he said. Diana was quiet for just a moment. The brief pause of a lawyer who had run this process carefully and whose professional satisfaction at its conclusion was genuine, even if her register didn't fully show it. I'll begin the paperwork today. Okay. Owen. Another pause. $20 million on a $100 purchase. Yeah, Owen said. I want you to sit with that number for a minute before we start talking about taxes and transaction structure. I'm sitting with it. Good. Because in about 48 hours, my phone is going to ring a great deal, and yours is going to ring more, and it's going to get loud. So right now, for this minute, just sit with it. Owen sat in his kitchen in the November morning with his phone in his hand and the folder on the table and the bare trees outside the window, and he sat with it. He thought about the ballroom, and the laughter, and the $100, and the shape of the suspension geometry and the burned-out wreck that nobody else had looked at long enough to see. He thought about Robert Aldous at 29, making a decision under fluorescent lights in a Coventry workshop, choosing to keep something alive because he couldn't bear to see it die. He thought about the box under the bed, kept for 60 years, and Margaret Aldis's handwriting on the note. He thought about Danny. He was going to have to figure out how to explain this to Danny in a way that made sense. Not the money. Danny would have thoughts about the money that would probably be simultaneously very practical and very 8-year-old, but the rest of it. The part about looking at something long enough to see what it actually was. The part about the difference between what something appears to be and what it is. He sat there for a while longer, in the quiet kitchen, with the light coming through the window and the coffee gone cold again. Then his phone rang. It was Diana. The press is calling, she said. You ready? Owen picked up the coffee mug, looked at it, set it back down. Through the window, he could see the garage. The door closed, the light off, the building ordinary and unassuming in the gray November morning, holding nothing remarkable at all to look at from the outside. Yeah, he said, let's go. The wire transfer cleared on a Wednesday morning in December, 3 days before Danny's winter break began. Owen was in the garage when Diana called to confirm it. Not working, just standing there in the cold with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, doing the particular kind of nothing that happens when a person's mind has been running hard for weeks and suddenly doesn't have an immediate problem to solve. The chassis was gone. Hartman's logistics team had collected it 10 days earlier with the careful, unhurried professionalism of people who moved significant things for a living, padded cradles, climate-controlled transport, documentation signed in triplicate. Owen had watched them loaded onto the specialized transport vehicle and had felt something he couldn't precisely name. Not loss exactly. More like the feeling you get when you finish a book, the slightly hollow, slightly satisfied knowledge that the thing is complete. It's done, Diana said. Net of fees and tax withholding, the figure in your account is... She read it out. Owen looked at the empty space on the garage floor where the DBS chassis had sat. The concrete was cleaner there than the surrounding area, protected from the accumulated grime of the garage by the drop cloths he'd laid down. A clean rectangle on the floor, like the outline of something. "Okay," he said. "That's all you've got, okay? What do you want me to say?" "I want you to say something that reflects the fact that you just received $20 million minus transaction costs and federal withholding," Diana said. "I've handled a lot of transactions. People usually have a reaction." "I have a reaction," Owen said. "I'm just having it quietly." A short pause. "Fair enough." He could hear papers moving on her end. "We should schedule a meeting with a financial advisor. I have 2 recommendations. Both solid, both experienced with sudden liquidity events, which is the technical term for what just happened to you." "Sudden liquidity event," Owen repeated. "It sounds clinical because it is. The clinical framing is useful. It keeps people from doing things in the first month that they regret in the first year." Another pause. "Owen, you did something genuinely extraordinary here. I just want to make sure the outcome is as good as the discovery." "Set up the meeting," Owen said. "And thank you, Diana, for all of it." "That's what I'm for," she said, in the tone of someone who meant it as more than a professional statement. "I'll be in touch." He hung up and stood in the garage alone with the clean rectangle on the floor and his lukewarm coffee and the December light coming pale through the high window, and he let himself have the reaction he'd told Diana he was having quietly. It was not clean or simple. It was several things at the same time. Relief that was almost physical, a loosening of something that had been held tight for so long that the loosening itself felt strange. And underneath the relief, a more complicated emotion that he would have had difficulty explaining to most people, but that he thought Robert Aldous might have understood. The feeling of having served as the right person in the right place at the right moment for something that deserved better than what it had gotten. He'd done right by the car. That mattered to him in a way that the number, for all its staggering weight, couldn't quite replicate. He finished the coffee, rinsed the mug at the garage sink, and went inside to start thinking about what came next. What came next turned out to be considerably louder and more demanding than Owen had anticipated, which was saying something because he had anticipated that it would be loud and demanding. The story had broken fully into mainstream press the day after Diana issued the acquisition announcement. Not just the collector world, not just automotive enthusiasts, but general news. The narrative was irresistible in the way that certain true stories are irresistible. The single father, the $100, the laughing room full of millionaires, the burned wreck that turned out to be something extraordinary. It had the shape of a fable, which meant that every outlet that ran it framed it slightly differently depending on what lesson they wanted it to teach. And Owen spent 2 weeks reading versions of his own story that were recognizable but subtly wrong in ways that were difficult to correct without engaging with the press more than Diana had advised. He did 2 interviews, both print, both on his own terms with Diana present. He was careful with his words and slightly uncomfortable in both conversations, which showed in the published pieces in ways that Owen thought were actually fine. He didn't want to read like someone who was comfortable with this, because he wasn't, and pretending otherwise would have been false. The piece in Automotive Heritage Quarterly ran 6,000 words and was the most accurate of anything published, partly because the journalist had done the actual research, and partly because Owen had spent 40 minutes on the phone with her going through the technical details of what he'd found and why it mattered. Reading it, Owen felt something close to satisfied. The engineering story was told correctly. Aldous was given his proper place in it, and the narrative of the car itself was respected rather than flattened into a parable about overlooked value. He made sure Margaret Aldous received a copy. She called him the week after it ran. He would have liked it, she said. She had her father's slight English formality and what sounded like genuine composure, the kind that comes from having had time to adjust to grief rather than from not feeling it. The engineering section especially, he always said journalists got the technical parts wrong. They usually do, Owen agreed. This one didn't. She called me too, the journalist. She asked about my father's notes, the ones in the box. I told her about sending them to you. I hope that was all right. More than all right. A brief pause. What will you do now? With the garage? With your work? It was the question that Owen had been turning over since the transaction closed, The one he'd been approaching from different angles at different times of day with different levels of clarity. "I'm going to build something," he said, "with the garage, something bigger than what it is now." "What kind of something?" "The kind where people who know what they're doing can work on things that matter. Real restoration work, not cosmetic." He paused, aware that he was describing a vision that was still more feeling than plan. "And something for younger people, apprentices, people who have the instinct for this work, but not the access." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "My father would have approved of that very much," she said. "He was always angry about how many talented young engineers got filtered out early because they came from the wrong background. He used to say the industry kept eating its own seed corn." "Yeah," Owen said, "it does." He'd been thinking about this, the apprenticeship idea, since Terrell had said what he'd said about his grandfather, about a car not being saved until it could drive again. He'd been thinking about it before that, if he was honest, in the vague, unspecific way that you think about things you want, but haven't yet given yourself permission to pursue seriously. He'd been thinking about the number of young people he'd encountered over the years who had the native intelligence for mechanical work, but no structured path into it, who picked things up in driveways and YouTube videos and garages like his through accident and persistence rather than design. The money made the thinking real. That was the primary thing the money did, Owen was discovering. It converted ideas that had been theoretical into things that required actual decisions. He met with the financial advisor Diana recommended, a deliberate, straightforward man named Carl Hecht, who had an office in Washington and who spent the first meeting mostly listening and asking questions, and the second meeting presenting a framework that was conservative in its structure and realistic in its projections. Owen was not a reckless person by nature, and Carl seemed to understand this quickly, which made the conversations efficient. "What are you trying to build?" Carl asked at the end of the second meeting. "A restoration workshop," Owen said. "Serious one, with an apprenticeship component. Commercial operation, nonprofit, or hybrid?" Owen looked at him. "What's the difference in practical terms?" Carl walked him through it. Commercial meant it needed to sustain itself on revenue, which meant careful pricing and consistent high-value work. Nonprofit meant fundraising and board structures and a different kind of administrative burden. Hybrid, a commercial operation with a nonprofit training arm, meant complexity but also flexibility. "Given your profile right now," Carl said carefully, "the philanthropic element would attract significant outside support. Your story has public resonance. There are foundations that fund exactly the kind of vocational training you're describing." Owen had not thought about this. He had been thinking of the apprenticeship component as something he would fund personally out of the sale proceeds, a project alongside the commercial work. The idea that it might attract independent support was new, and he sat with it for a moment. "I don't want to run a nonprofit," he said. "I want to run a garage." "Then run the garage," Carl said. "Hire someone to run the nonprofit arm. Your job is the cars." That was, Owen thought, the most useful thing anyone had said to him in weeks. He told Terrell about the plan on a Thursday afternoon in the garage, while they were finishing the final cleanup and inventory of the space after the chassis departure. Terrell had been patient about not asking, which Owen had noticed and appreciated, and he deserved to hear it directly before it became anything official. Terrell listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was not his usual conversational mode. He was normally someone who engaged actively, questions and responses woven throughout. His silence meant he was thinking rather than waiting to talk. "Apprentices," he said when Owen finished. "Like high school kids?" "High school, some community college. People who are good with their hands and don't know yet that there's a real profession here." Owen looked at him. "I'd want you to be part of it, not just helping out. Actually part of it. There's a role here if you want it." Terrell was quiet for another moment. He looked around the garage at the tools, the lift, the workbenches, the organized space that they'd been working in together for 2 years. "What kind of role?" "Senior technician to start. Probably more than that as it grows, if you want it to be." Owen paused. "You're good at teaching people things. You did it with me with the electrical work, the way you explained things. You didn't talk down to me, you just explained. That's harder than it sounds." Terrell looked at the floor for a moment. He had the expression of someone trying to decide whether something is real. I was explaining things to you, he said. You built half this garage. That doesn't mean I knew what you knew about electrical, Owen said. Expertise doesn't transfer automatically. You have to be able to teach it. He looked at him directly. I'm serious, Terrell. This isn't charity. I need people who know what they're doing and can also help younger people learn it. That's you. Terrell nodded slowly and then a little faster, like something settling into place. Yeah, he said. Yeah. Okay. The call from Vivian Ashcroft's office came in the second week of January. It was not Vivian who called, but her assistant, a brisk, organized young woman named Claire, who asked if Owen was available for a brief call with Ms. Ashcroft at his earliest convenience, and gave the impression that Ms. Ashcroft's earliest convenience and Owen's would ideally coincide. Owen said Thursday worked. Claire confirmed Thursday at 2. He drove into Washington for the call because he had a meeting with Carl Hecht in the morning, and it made sense to stay in the city rather than drive back and forth. He took the call from a coffee shop near Carl's office. Sitting at a corner table with a cappuccino he didn't particularly need, and his phone on the table in front of him, Vivian answered her own phone, which surprised him slightly. Mr. Granger, she said. Thank you for making time. Sure, Owen said. He had learned in the months since the auction that she communicated more efficiently without preamble, and he matched that register. What can I do for you? I want to talk to you about the Ashcroft Automotive Legacy Annual Collectors Conference, she said. It's held in March. This year it's in Chicago, the Kimball Grand. 2 days, approximately 300 attendees, mix of collectors, dealers, historians, and industry professionals. A brief pause. I want to invite you to speak. Owen had not expected this. Speak about what? About the DBS, about what you found, how you found it, what the experience was from your side. Another pause. And about the broader question of how our industry evaluates what it looks at, what we miss, and why. He was quiet for a moment, turning this over. That's a pretty pointed invitation, given that the thing I'd be talking about came out of your auction floor. Yes, Vivian said simply. It is. You understand that I'm not going to stand up in front of your industry and pretend the situation unfolded well on your end. I'm not asking you to, she said. There was something in her voice that had not been there in their earlier conversations. A quality that Owen, after a moment, identified as the particular tone of someone who has arrived at a decision through a difficult internal process and is now on the other side of it. I'm asking you to tell the truth about what happened, including the parts that are unflattering to this company and to me personally. Owen looked out the window of the coffee shop at the January street. A gray, cold Washington morning, people moving with their shoulders up around their ears against the wind. Why? He asked. What do you get out of that? I get to be the person who invited you rather than the person who tried to stop you, she said. I get to stand in front of an industry that I've been part of my whole career and demonstrate that admitting a mistake is not fatal. A pause. And honestly, the conference needs it. We have too many people in that room who are very good at appearing to know things and not good enough at admitting when they don't. An injection of reality would be useful. You're asking me to embarrass you in front of 300 people. I'm asking you to tell the truth in front of 300 people, she corrected. Whether that's embarrassing depends on how you tell it. Owen drank his cappuccino and thought about this. He thought about Danny, who had been told the whole story by now, in age-appropriate installments over several evenings at the kitchen table, and whose primary takeaway had been the question, why did the lady sell it if she knew it was important? Owen had tried to explain about convenience and cover and looking at things the way you need them to be, and Danny had listened and then said, with the flat, cutting accuracy that children sometimes produce without understanding how sharp it is, she was scared to be wrong, so she pretended she was right. Owen had looked at his son and thought that was probably the most accurate summary of human behavior he'd heard all year. All right, he said to Vivian, I'll speak. A brief silence that he couldn't read. Thank you, she said. Claire will send you the details. One thing, Owen said before she could hang up. I'm going to talk about Aldous, about the program, about what the car actually was and where it came from and the human story of it, not just the transaction. Of course, Vivian said. That's the story that matters. She hung up. Owen sat for a moment with the phone in his hand, in the corner of the coffee shop, watching the gray January street. He thought about standing up in front of 300 people and telling a story that included, without softening it, the part where a room full of experts laughed at a $100 purchase. He thought about Vivian Ashcroft choosing to invite that into her own conference, choosing accountability over the far easier option of simply moving on and letting the story be what the press had already made it. The humble mechanic and the overlooked treasure, which was true as far as it went, but which left out the part about choices and consequences and the particular cost of looking at things the way you need them to be. He drove back to Culpeper in the early afternoon, thinking about what he wanted to say. The conference was on a Saturday in March, and Owen drove to Chicago with Danny because Danny's spring break overlapped with it, and because Owen had no reliable childcare for 3 days at short notice, and because Danny, when told about it, had said, "I want to come," with the specific certainty that meant he'd already decided and was informing Owen rather than asking. They drove the 10 hours in the truck, which at this point had cleared 190,000 miles, and which Owen had no intention of replacing because it still ran fine, a position that Danny found simultaneously admirable and slightly incomprehensible now that the financial situation had changed. "You could get a new truck," Danny said, somewhere in Ohio. "This one works," Owen said. "Yeah, but it's old. So is the Aston Martin, and you didn't want to leave that behind." Danny considered this. "That's different." "It's not that different." Danny looked out the window at the Ohio highway, processing this with the slightly reluctant expression he wore when he'd been out-argued. "Fine," he said, "but the heater smells funny." "The heater has always smelled funny. That doesn't mean it should keep smelling funny." They stopped at a rest area in Indiana and ate sandwiches from the cooler Owen had packed, sitting on the tailgate in the gray March cold, and Danny asked questions about the conference and what Owen was going to say, and Owen tried to explain it in terms that made sense for an 8-year-old, which was actually useful because the process of making something comprehensible to an 8-year-old usually forced you to find the actual core of it. "I'm going to tell them what happened," Owen said. "All of it." "Including the part where the lady sold it wrong?" "Yeah, including that part." "Is she going to be there?" "Yes." Danny chewed his sandwich and looked at the gray Indiana sky. "Is it going to be awkward?" Owen thought about this honestly. "Probably a little." "But you're doing it anyway." "Yeah," Danny nodded, apparently satisfied with the internal logic of this. "Okay," he said. "Good." The Kimball Grand was the kind of hotel that made Owen peripherally aware of his own clothing choices in a way that he tried to ignore and mostly succeeded. He was wearing the same jacket from the wedding, which still fit mostly, and he'd bought a new dress shirt that Danny had helped him pick, standing in the men's section of a department store in Culpeper with the focused critical attention of someone who had opinions. The shirt was dark blue. Danny had declared it good. Vivian met them in the lobby. She was composed and direct, the way she always was, but Owen noticed immediately that something in her bearing was different from the woman who had stood in his living room and offered him $5 million. That woman had been controlled in the way that people are controlled when they are managing a situation. This was something else. She extended her hand to Owen, and then, without apparent calculation, she looked down at Danny. "This is your son," she said. "Danny," Owen said. "Danny, this is Ms. Ashcroft." Danny shook her hand with the solemnity of an 8-year-old who had been taught that handshakes were serious. "You're the lady who sold the car," he said. A brief silence in which Owen considered intervening and decided not to. "I am," Vivian said. "For $100, Danny added. "Not unkindly, just confirming facts." "Yes," Vivian said, "for $100. She looked at him with an expression that Owen couldn't fully read, but which seemed genuine. "I made a mistake." Danny looked at her for a moment. "My dad says everyone makes mistakes. The question is what you do after." Vivian looked at him for another moment. "Your dad is right," she said. Danny nodded, apparently accepting this, and went back to looking at the hotel lobby. Owen caught Vivian's eye. She had the expression of someone who has just been assessed by a party they hadn't fully prepared for and found it unexpectedly clarifying. The conference session was in the Kimball's main hall, a large, well-appointed room with round tables and a stage at one end, filled with exactly the kind of people Owen had expected: collectors in expensive casual wear, dealers with the particular alertness of people perpetually evaluating what was around them, museum professionals with the slightly academic bearing of their environment. Around 280 people, Owen estimated, maybe a few more. A full house. Vivian opened the session herself from the stage and did something that Owen had not anticipated. She told the story straight. Not a sanitized version, not a corporate communications framing, the actual sequence of events, including her own role in it, including the approval signature on the catalog entry, including the 45-minute assessment and the $100 opening bid, and the room of experts who had let it go without a second look. She told it in about 10 minutes, standing at the podium without notes, with the composed, slightly formal delivery of someone who has made a deliberate choice to be uncomfortable in public and is seeing it through. The room was very quiet. "I invited Owen Granger to speak today," she said at the end of her opening, "because the most instructive part of this story doesn't belong to me. I can tell you what we missed. He can tell you what to look for." She stepped back from the podium and looked at Owen, who was sitting in the front row with Danny beside him. Danny with a hotel notepad he'd been given at check-in and was using to draw what appeared to be a plan of the garage layout. Owen walked to the stage. He looked out at the room, at the 300 faces, some of them curious, some of them guarded, some of them already doing the professional calculation of what this story meant for their own practices and reputations. He recognized the calculation. He'd been in rooms his whole life where people were doing that particular math. He talked for 40 minutes. He talked about the suspension geometry, specifically, technically, in language that the mechanics and engineers in the room would recognize, and that the collectors and dealers would understand even if they couldn't reproduce it. He talked about the difference between looking at something and seeing it, not as a philosophical proposition, but as a practical one, rooted in the specific habits of attention that technical work builds if you let it. He talked about Aldous and the box under the bed, and what it meant that a 29-year-old engineer had used his own salary to keep something alive because he knew it mattered even when nobody in authority agreed. He talked about the storage facility fire and the estate sale and the incomplete VIN and the 45-minute assessment, and he did not editorialize about any of it. He simply described what had happened and let the room do the work of understanding what it meant. He talked about his son, briefly, about the question Danny had asked in the kitchen that morning after Vivian had left, the question about whether the car was worth more. He talked about what it meant to answer that question honestly without knowing the full answer yet, and about the difference between instinct and certainty and how you navigate that difference when the stakes are real. He did not perform humility. He did not perform anything. He just talked about what had happened and what he thought it meant, in the direct, undecorated way that he talked about everything that mattered to him. The room was quiet throughout in the particular way that rooms are quiet when the people in them are actually listening rather than waiting to respond. When he finished, there was a moment of actual silence. Not the polite pause before applause, but a real one, a beat of something being absorbed. And then the room came alive. The questions afterward ran 45 minutes over the scheduled time. Not softballs. The people in this room were knowledgeable enough to ask hard things about methodology and provenance verification and the structural problems of incentive-driven assessment in auction environments, and Owen answered everything directly, including the questions that implicitly criticized practices he'd seen throughout the process. A dealer in the third row asked him, with barely concealed defensiveness, whether he thought the industry systematically undervalued things from working-class sources. Owen said yes, he did, and explained specifically why he thought so, and the dealer didn't ask a follow-up. Vivian sat in the front row throughout and didn't intervene in any of the questions, which Owen noticed and respected. Afterward, in the hallway outside the main hall, while Danny ate a hotel cookie he'd acquired from somewhere and drew on his notepad, Vivian found Owen next to the window that looked out over the Chicago street below. "Thank you," she said, "for not softening it. Told me not to." "I know. People don't always take me at my word." She looked out the window for a moment. She had the bearing of someone who has completed something difficult and is still processing whether the completion feels the way they'd expected. "The dealer who asked you the class question," Harwick, Owen said. He'd seen the name on the conference program. "He does 200 transactions a year. His assessment process is exactly the kind of 45 minutes and done that let your car go through the floor. She paused. He's not going to change anything based on today. I want to be honest about that. I know, Owen said, but some of the people in that room will. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. That's worth something. Yeah, Owen said. It is. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that Owen hadn't expected and that stayed with him for a long time afterward. I've been thinking about what your son said to you in the kitchen, she said, the question about why I sold it. You told the story in your talk, that she was scared to be wrong, so she pretended she was right version. I paraphrased, Owen said. No, you didn't. That's exactly what I did. She said it without self-pity, with the same flat accuracy she'd used on the phone months earlier. And I've been thinking, what's the correction to that? Not philosophically, practically. What does it look like to actually build an organization where that doesn't happen? Owen looked at her. This was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not performative. You're asking me? You're the one who found the car, she said. He thought about it for a moment, seriously. You changed the incentive structure, he said. Right now, a bad assessment has no cost to the assessor if it produces a sale. You have to build in accountability, flag it, record it, review it, make missing something a data point that comes back around. He paused. And you hire people who know what they don't know. The 45-minute assessment wasn't just too fast. It was done by someone who'd never worked on British experimental vehicles from that period. He didn't know what he was looking at. Vivian was listening with the focused, processing attention of someone taking notes without paper. The apprenticeship thing you're building, she said. The restoration center. It's in early stages. I want to be involved, she said, not as a funder writing a check and walking away. As a partner. My company has industry relationships and an acquisitions network and access to vehicles that need exactly the kind of preservation work you're describing. She looked at him steadily. I understand if that's not something you want, given the history. Owen looked at her, at the composure that was real but no longer looked like a wall, at the person who had stood up in front of her own conference and told the story against herself, at the woman who had called him to give him the truth before someone else gave him a version of it. He thought about what Danny had said on the tailgate in Indiana. The question is what you do after. Let's talk about it, he said. Not today, but let's talk about it. Talk. Something in her expression relaxed slightly. Not relief, not warmth exactly, but the particular quality of someone who has been holding a position carefully and has just been told they can stay. Okay, she said, let's talk about it. Danny appeared at Owen's elbow with his notepad and held it up. On it, he had drawn, with the focused, slightly too large pencil lines of an 8-year-old working carefully, a floor plan of what appeared to be a garage layout significantly larger than their current one, with labeled bays and a section in the corner marked in block letters, Apprentices. Owen looked at it. I've been planning, Danny said. Vivian looked at the drawing. How many bays? She asked. Danny pointed. 6 working bays, 2 prep bays, and a parts storage that connects to the main floor so you don't have to walk outside. He looked at her seriously. You need good flow. My dad taught me that. If the flow is wrong, everything takes longer. Vivian studied the drawing with the same focused attention she brought to auction catalogs and acquisition documentation. The parts storage connection is smart, she said. Most facilities don't have that, and it costs them time every day. Danny looked pleased in the specific way of a kid whose practical idea has been recognized by an adult as actually practical. That's what I thought, he said. Owen stood between them, his son with his hotel notepad and his floor plans, and the woman who had started this whole thing with a $100 mistake, and felt something settle. Not into place exactly, more like into motion. The specific forward motion of things that have found their direction and are moving now, with or without your certainty that they're going the right way. He looked at the drawing once more. 6 working bays, 2 prep bays, parts storage with direct floor connection. Not bad, he thought, for an 8-year-old. Not bad at all. Danny's floor plan ended up being more prophetic than decorative. Owen had folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket on the drive back from Chicago, which Danny noticed and did not comment on, but which clearly registered, because 2 weeks later, he asked Owen whether he'd kept it. Owen showed him the folded hotel notepad paper, slightly creased from the pocket, and Danny nodded with the satisfied expression of someone whose work had been properly archived. The actual design process for the new facility took 8 months, which was 4 months longer than Owen had expected, and about right, according to everyone who had done something similar before. There were architects and zoning considerations, and structural engineers, and a contractor who came highly recommended and turned out to be highly recommended for good reason, meaning he was thorough and honest and delivered bad news early rather than late, which was a quality Owen valued above almost every other professional attribute. There were conversations with Carl Hecht about capital allocation that were sometimes tedious and always necessary. There were long evenings at the kitchen table with drawings and spreadsheets, and the occasional deep uncertainty that comes from committing to something larger than anything you've done before. Owen bought land outside Culpeper, 12 acres on the western edge of town, far enough from the residential neighborhoods to accommodate the noise and the truck traffic that a working restoration facility generates, close enough to remain connected to the community he'd been part of for the past 9 years. The property had an existing structure, an old agricultural building that the contractor assessed and declared structurally sound but functionally inadequate, which meant they renovated rather than demolished, preserving the bones and rebuilding everything around them. Owen liked this. It felt consistent with the work. Granger Restoration opened on a Tuesday morning in early November, 14 months after the DBS chassis had left his old garage on Hartman's climate-controlled transport. The opening was not an event. Owen had been offered an event. Vivian had suggested a ribbon cutting, a press opportunity, a gathering of industry figures, and had declined it. What he did instead was open the doors at 7:30 in the morning, the way he'd opened the doors of the old garage every working day for 11 years, and start work. The first vehicle on the lift was a 1971 Alfa Romeo Spider that belonged to a retired teacher in Warrenton who had bought it for $3,000 in 1989 and driven it for 6 years before the transmission gave out, and life had gotten complicated. The car had been in her garage for 26 years. She'd called Owen after reading the Automotive Heritage quarterly piece, not because she thought her Alfa was historically significant, she was clear-eyed about that, but because she'd read that he was the kind of person who thought that a car deserved to be saved even when it wasn't worth a fortune. Owen had told her to bring it in. Terrell was there from day one, officially titled Senior Restoration Technician, a title he'd looked at for a moment when Owen showed him the paperwork and then said, was fine. He had 2 additional full-time technicians working under him, both experienced, both serious, and the facility had the capacity for 6 simultaneous restoration projects at different stages. The parts storage connected directly to the main floor, just as Danny had designed it. The apprenticeship program was a separate operation, technically under the nonprofit structure Carl and Diana had helped establish. The Aldis Foundation for Automotive Craft, named after Robert Aldis at Margaret's quiet, pleased suggestion. It launched with 4 apprentices in the first cohort, 3 recent high school graduates, and one 23-year-old who had been working retail for 2 years because nobody had told him there was a path into the work he'd been doing in his uncle's driveway since he was 15. They were paid a training stipend. They worked 3 days a week in the facility alongside the full-time technicians and spent 2 days in structured instruction. Owen had hired a curriculum developer, a woman named Priya Vasquez, who had spent 8 years designing vocational training programs and who had opinions about everything and was right about most of them. Vivian had connected him with 2 of the 4 initial funding partners for the foundation, which was part of the partnership arrangement they'd worked out in a series of conversations that had stretched from March through August, and which Diana had overseen with the careful attention of someone who understood that the legal structure of a partnership mattered less than the clarity of what each party was bringing and expecting. What Vivian brought was industry relationships, access, and a platform. Her company's network, her conference, the credibility of the Ashcroft Automotive legacy name used in service of something other than auction revenue. What she expected was to be taken seriously as a partner rather than a benefactor, which Owen had agreed to and meant. It was not a simple relationship. They disagreed about things, about the pace of expansion, about which vehicles the foundation should accept for training purposes versus which should go to commercial restoration. about the degree of public visibility Owen was comfortable with. Vivian was someone who understood the value of visibility and used it strategically. Owen was someone who found it uncomfortable and tolerated it instrumentally. These were real tensions that produced real arguments, conducted mostly over the phone and occasionally in person, at meetings that started tightly scheduled and ran long because neither of them was willing to leave a disagreement unresolved. "You're bad at compromise," Vivian told him during one of these conversations in the fall of the second year. "I'm bad at false compromise," Owen said. "There's a difference." "You think there is. You think there isn't?" A pause. "I think you use the distinction to avoid conceding points you've already lost the argument on." Owen thought about this for a moment. "That's probably sometimes true," he said. "Probably," Vivian agreed. They found their working rhythm the way most partnerships find it, not by resolving their differences, but by learning which differences were productive and which were just friction, and gradually getting better at telling them apart. By the second year, they had established a functional shorthand, the kind that develops between people who spend enough time solving problems together that they begin to anticipate each other's objections. It wasn't ease. It was something more durable than ease. A kind of calibrated respect built on the knowledge that each of them was genuinely capable of things the other wasn't. The Zurich exhibition opened in April of the second year. Hartman had been true to his letter. The gallery, named the Aldous Gallery, after Owen's condition and Hartman's genuine agreement, was a purpose-built space within his existing museum facility outside Zurich, designed around the vehicle rather than the other way around. Owen flew over for the opening, leaving Danny with Ruth Calloway, who had been unfazed by the request in the specific way that Ruth was unfazed by everything that fell within the scope of what she considered her responsibilities, which was a larger scope than most people realized. The gallery was not what Owen had expected, which was to say it was better than he'd imagined and also more affecting than he'd prepared himself for. The DBS, restored now to a standard that Covington had supervised and Owen had reviewed through photographs at every stage, working with a British restoration specialist whom Hartman had retained and who had consulted Aldous's original technical drawings throughout, sat in the center of the space on a low platform, under focused light that showed every line of its engineering without dramatizing it. The suspension geometry was visible through a cutaway section of the lower body, displayed with an explanatory panel in 4 languages that explained what it was and what it represented. The Aldous documents, the originals carefully conserved and framed, lined one wall. The photograph of the young Robert Aldous leaning against the front wing on the test track was enlarged and mounted at the entrance. Margaret Aldous had come for the opening. She was 68, with her father's careful precision and a directness that Owen recognized from their phone calls. She stood in front of her father's photograph for a long time, and Owen stood nearby without saying anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the room wasn't already saying. After a while, she turned to him. "He would have been insufferable about this," she said. Owen looked at her. Insufferable how? He would have said, "I told you so," to literally everyone he'd ever known, she said. He would have written letters. He kept an actual address book, with people's addresses in it, handwritten. He would have written letters to every person in that book telling them that he'd been right. Owen smiled. What was he right about? That it would matter. She looked at the photograph again. He spent 40 years not knowing whether it was even still out there, but he never stopped believing that if it was, it would matter to someone, someday. She paused. He told me once that the worst thing that can happen to something important isn't destruction. It's being found by the wrong person. Owen looked at her. He thought I was the right person? He said you sounded like someone who looked at things, she said. He said that's the whole thing, really, whether you look at things. Owen stood in that gallery for a long time after the reception crowd had thinned and the caterers had begun quietly clearing glasses. He stood and looked at the car, at the suspension geometry he'd seen in a ballroom in Virginia on a Tuesday evening in October, from the back of the room while everyone around him was looking at something else. He thought about the distance between that moment and this one, not in terms of money or recognition or the accumulation of things that had changed, but in terms of the specific thread that connected them, a habit of attention, a refusal to let the consensus of a room determine what he was allowed to see. He thought about his father, who had been a carpenter, and who had taught Owen very few explicit lessons, but had demonstrated one repeatedly and without commentary throughout Owen's childhood. The practice of looking at a thing long enough to understand what it was before deciding what to do with it. His father had applied this to wood, to joinery, to the particular behavior of materials under stress. Owen had applied it to engines, to chassis, to the specific vocabulary of mechanical engineering. Danny, it appeared, was applying it to floor plans and organizational structures, which suggested the habit was transmissible even if the domain wasn't. He thought that this was finally the only story here that was really his to tell. Not the money. The money was real, and it mattered, and it had changed the practical shape of his life in ways he was still absorbing. But the money was the outcome, not the thing itself. The thing itself was a habit, practiced over years in a two-bay garage in Culpeper, in the unglamorous and solitary work of looking at things other people had given up on and asking what they actually were. You could not sell that. You could not auction it or authenticate it or transfer it in a wire. You could only practice it, day after day, in ordinary light, with ordinary tools, on things that nobody thought were worth looking at. He flew back to Culpeper the next morning. The second cohort of apprentices started in September of the second year. 6 this time, drawn from a slightly wider geographic area after the Foundation's existence had become known through a combination of word of mouth and a piece in a trade journal that Vivian had facilitated. The youngest was 17, a girl named Kezia from a town in West Virginia who had been fixing small engines since she was 12, and who arrived on the first day with a canvas tool roll that she'd assembled herself. The tools clean and organized with the particular care of someone who had learned early that their tools were a serious investment. Owen watched her work on her first afternoon and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. She knew what she was doing, she just hadn't been given a context in which to do it properly. Priya had developed a curriculum that was, in Owen's view, genuinely good. Not good in the way that things are good when the person who made them tells you they're good, but good in the demonstrable sense that the first cohort had come out of it with skills that were visibly and specifically real. 3 of the 4 had continued with the Foundation into a second year of advanced work. The 4th had taken a position at a respected restoration shop in Richmond, which his supervisor there had described to Owen in a brief call as the best prepared entry-level technician I've seen in 15 years. Owen had told Terrell, who had been more directly responsible for that outcome than anyone, and Terrell had absorbed it with the quiet satisfaction of a person who doesn't make a show of caring about things, but cares deeply. Terrell was, by the second year, not just a senior technician, but the operational backbone of the facility. The person who knew where everything was, who understood the flow of work across all 6 bays, who could tell you in 40 seconds what was happening on any project and what the next constraint was. Owen had offered him an equity stake in the commercial operation during the second year, a conversation that had been slightly awkward in the specific way that conversations about money between people who respect each other sometimes are, and which had concluded with Terrell saying, "Yeah, okay," in the same tone he'd used when Owen had offered him the role in the first place, the tone of someone who has been told something true and is accepting it without drama. Danny turned 10 in the spring of the second year, and Owen threw him a birthday party in the workshop. Not a children's party exactly, but the kind of gathering that happens when a kid has grown up around working people and his social world is a mix of school friends and the adults from his father's work life. Ruth Calloway brought 3 casseroles and a cake. Terrell brought Danny a set of precision screwdrivers in a proper case, which Danny received with a seriousness that made several adults in the room quietly smile. Vivian, who had driven down from D.C. for reasons she described as being in the area, which Owen didn't entirely believe but appreciated, brought a book about the history of British motorsport that was clearly something she'd thought about rather than grabbed quickly. Danny opened it and looked at the photographs for a while, and then looked up at Vivian with the directness he brought to everything. "Is this about the kind of cars your family used to make?" "Some of them," Vivian said. "Do you know a lot about them?" "I know a reasonable amount." Danny considered her for a moment. "You could help with my next project," he said. "We're doing a presentation about an industry that changed because of technology. I was going to do automobiles." Vivian looked at him for a moment with the same expression she'd had in the hotel lobby when he'd told her about the $100 sale. The expression of someone encountering a party they hadn't fully prepared for. "I could probably help with that," she said. "Good," Danny said, and went back to the book. Owen watched this from across the room, leaning against the workbench with a beer he'd barely touched, and thought about the ways that things connect when you're not managing them. The specific organic way that people find each other and find uses for each other when the context is right, and nobody is trying too hard to make it happen. He thought about Vivian at 32, running a company with the focused, defended efficiency of someone who had been told she needed to be twice as certain as everyone else to be taken half as seriously, and who had responded to that by becoming exactly that certain, at the cost of something that he couldn't name precisely, but that he thought was something like openness. The willingness to not know what something was before you knew what you needed it to be. He thought she was finding some of that back, not in a dramatic way, not in the way stories sometimes want you to believe people change, suddenly and completely and with visible transformation. More in the way that people actually change, which is incrementally and imperfectly and with setbacks, and not always in the direction you'd predict. She was still controlled. She still managed things. But there were moments, in their arguments, in her conversations with Danny, in the way she'd stood at that podium in Chicago and told the room a story against herself, where something underneath the control was present and visible, and Owen thought that was worth something, regardless of what you called it. 3 years after the auction, Owen drove to Zurich alone. It was January, gray and cold, and he took the train from the airport to the town near Hartman's estate, and walked the last half-mile on a road that was quiet and slightly icy and lined with bare winter trees. He told Hartman he was coming, and Hartman had made the gallery available outside of public hours, which was what Owen had asked for. He wanted to see it without the crowd. The gallery was lit but empty when he arrived. A staff member let him in and left him alone, closing the door quietly behind her. Owen stood in the space for a moment, adjusting. The DBS sat on its platform under the focused light, still and permanent looking in the way of museum objects, things that have been removed from time and placed in a different relationship to it. He walked around it slowly, the way he'd walked around it the first morning in his garage, with the same deliberate, unpressured attention. He looked at the suspension geometry through the cutaway panel. He looked at the chassis reinforcement visible in the display section. He looked at the engine bay, restored to its original mounting configuration, with the larger displacement mounting points that had told him, back on a cold concrete floor in Culpeper, that something unusual had been built here. He stood in front of the photograph of Aldous for a long time, 29 years old, leaning against the front wing, looking at the camera with the expression of a person deciding something. Owen was 38 now. He thought about the distance between 29 and 38 and what it contained. The things you lose and the things you build, and the ways that the building sometimes compensates for the losing and sometimes doesn't, and the long, ongoing work of telling the difference. He thought about Sarah, Danny's mother, who had left when Danny was 2, and who was now living in Portland with a new family, and who maintained a careful civil relationship with Owen around school schedules and holidays that was better for Danny than it was comfortable for either of them. He thought about the specific quality of loneliness that single parenthood produces. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, accumulated kind, the end-of-day kind, the kind that lives in the space between Danny's bedtime and your own. He thought that the last 2 years had filled some of that space in ways he hadn't anticipated and hadn't quite let himself expect. He thought that life was not a restoration project precisely because the metaphor only went so far. You couldn't disassemble a life and lay the parts on clean drop cloths and work methodically through the damage to find what was underneath. Life didn't hold still. The damage happened while you were working on it, and the working was part of the life, and the only real skill was learning to do both at the same time without dropping the thing you were trying to save. He stood in that gallery for an hour and a half. When he came out, Hartman was waiting in the courtyard with 2 cups of coffee, which was either good timing or the staff member had called ahead, and Owen didn't ask which. Hartman was in his late 60s, a compact, precise man with the patient quality of someone who had spent decades building something carefully. They'd met only once before, briefly, during the transaction. They shook hands in the cold January courtyard and drank the coffee. Well, Hartman said. It's right, Owen said. The gallery. It's right. Hartman nodded. The panel about the geometry, the suspension panel. 3 of my regular visitors last month were engineers. One of them stood there for 40 minutes. He looked at Owen with a slight, genuine smile. He came back the following week with his daughter. Owen thought about Aldous and his carefully kept address book and the letters he would have written. He thought about Terrell's grandfather and cars that weren't really saved until they could drive again. He thought about Kezia with her canvas tool roll on her first afternoon, and the second cohort, and the third cohort that Priya was already designing curriculum for. He thought about Danny's floor plan, folded in the inside pocket of his jacket on the drive back from Chicago, still in a drawer in his office at the facility because Owen was not a sentimental person in any obvious way, but was apparently a person who kept certain things. Can I ask you something? Owen said. Of course. Why 20 million? You could have gotten it for less. The next offer was 16. Hartman held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at it for a moment. I paid 20 million because I wanted there to be no ambiguity, he said, about what I thought it was worth, about what I thought the person who found it was worth. He looked at Owen evenly. You could have sold it for 8 million to someone who would have put it in a container. You didn't. That choice deserved to be compensated. Owen looked at him. That's not usually how transactions work. No, Hartman agreed. It isn't. A brief pause. But that's what I thought was right, so that's what I paid. Owen drove back to the airport in a rental car through the winter Swiss countryside, through villages that looked like they had been placed carefully and left exactly where they'd been put. And he thought about worth and what determined it. Not market worth, not auction worth, but the other kind. The kind that doesn't clear easily and doesn't appear on a wire transfer and doesn't resolve into a number that Diana can read out on a phone call. The kind that lives in 45 years of storage fees paid out of a young engineer's salary and in a box under a bed, and in the habit of looking at things long enough to see them. He thought that you couldn't always choose your circumstances. You couldn't choose whether the car that contained something extraordinary ended up on an auction floor for $100, instead of in the hands of someone who would have recognized it immediately. You couldn't choose whether the room was laughing at you or with you. You couldn't choose what got burned and what survived the fire. What you could choose was how you looked. Whether you looked at things the way you needed them to be or the way they were. Whether you were willing to stay in front of something long enough, in ordinary light, with your own knowledge and your own accumulated attention, to see what it actually was. That was the whole of it, Owen thought. That was the thing that could not be auctioned or authenticated or transferred. It was the one skill that mattered, and it was built in the slow, unremarkable accumulation of days spent paying attention to what was in front of you, in garages and workshops and ordinary rooms, on cold concrete floors, in ballrooms where everyone else had already decided. The flight home was long, and he slept for part of it, badly. The way you sleep on planes when you're tired enough to need sleep, but not tired enough to ignore the discomfort. He woke over the Atlantic with the particular disorientation of mid-flight waking, the plane dark around him and the window showing nothing but black, and he sat with the disorientation for a moment without fighting it. Danny would be at school, Ruth would have gotten him on the bus, Terrell would have the morning meeting at the facility underway, going through the week's project status in the methodical way he'd developed, which was more structured than Owen's own approach, and probably better. Kezia would be in the second bay, working on the carburetor rebuild that she'd started the week before, and which she'd described to Owen on Friday afternoon with the particular precision of someone who had been thinking about a problem overnight and come back to it with a clearer understanding. Priya would be somewhere in the building, revising the third cohort curriculum with the perfectionist intensity that Owen had learned to trust, even when it made scheduling complicated. The facility would be running, the work would be happening, the things he'd built would be doing what things do when they're built well, holding up without him standing next to them. He looked out the dark window at nothing and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite peace, but was in the neighborhood of both. The specific feeling of a person who has done the work that was in front of them, as well as they knew how, and who is now in the particular dark between one thing and whatever comes next. He pulled out his phone and opened his photos and looked at a picture he'd taken in the gallery that afternoon before Hartman came out with the coffee. It was the photograph of Robert Aldous, the enlarged version on the gallery wall, young and alive and leaning against a car that nobody thought was worth saving, looking at the camera with the expression of someone deciding something. Owen looked at it for a while. Then he put the phone away and closed his eyes, and the plane moved through the dark over the Atlantic, carrying him home.